sorry. Thank you for the opportunity to present my paper. I'm talking about the representation of migration in films of the Iranian diaspora. The historical starting point in the reflection about the representation of migration in films of the Iranian diaspora is the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which caused a fortified migration towards the West. There are only estimates as to how many Iranians currently live in the diaspora, but it ranges from 3 to 5 million, mostly in Europe and the US. California has the largest and probably most diverse concentration of Iranians in the diaspora. Los Angeles was therefore dubbed Irangeles, or also Tehrangeles, a neologism referring to the cultural mixture where the diasporized meet the host in the scene of migration. This brings me to one of the key notions directly connected to diaspora, the notion of hybridity. The hybrid is a usefully slippery category purposefully contested and deployed to claim change. It means all sorts of things mixing and combining different elements in the moment of cultural exchange. In addition to this general position, I want to point out hybridity as an evocative term for the formation of identity. With relation to diaspora, the most conventional accounts assert hybridity as the process of cultural mixture where the diasporic arrivals adopt aspects of the host culture and rework, reform, and reconfigure this in production of a new hybrid culture or hybrid identities. These hybrid identities accrue from a constant dialectic between adopting and separating from the host culture. In a diaspora, identity pre-exists, plays, and tries to recreate it, to remodel it in order to reproduce itself. The Iranian diaspora is consisted of a migration which goes most of the time only in one direction, from the east to the west. The term diaspora is nowadays applied more and more to all forms of migration, which corresponds to a weakening or at least limitation of the role played by nation-states at a time when globalization has become a dominant process. The concept of diaspora from a geographical point of view takes into account its materiality in terms of space, place, and nation in exile. People living in a diaspora have the feeling of belonging to a nation in exile, dispersed throughout the world bearing an ideal. The diaspora functions as a hinge between different spaces and different geographical scales. The relationship between diasporas and space or territories have their own specificities. Belonging to a diaspora implies being able to live simultaneously on the transnational world scale, the local scale of the community, and the scale of the host and home country. The Iranian diaspora is a recent one, having started in 1979. It can be defined as what Janine de Hinden calls a localized diasporic transnational formation. It combines low levels of transnational mobility with high levels of local encourage in the receiving and low levels of local encourage in the sending country. Iranians have experienced most of the time one-way migration in their family from a place of origin to a new country, perhaps also secondary migration to a third or fourth country. However, due to political circumstances, they do not circulate between the new country and the homeland. They and their offspring are settled in the new host country where they are socially and economically integrated. For this reason, they are called localized, although we are talking about a group of spatially dispersed persons who are characterized by an orientation to a real or imagined homeland. Being by definition a cinema that originated from marginalized collectivities that are negotiating their place in the social fabric of hegemonial host societies, migrant and diasporic cinema is certainly centrally concerned with identity politics and the other. Inscribed in these films is the collective memory or post-memory of the migratory experience, which has had a profound impact on the cultural identity and the aesthetic sensibilities of migrant and diasporic filmmakers. Referring to diaspora as a traveling term reflecting the importance of movement and circulation, I want to have a closer look on how identities are shaped towards places and spaces in the films of the Iranian diaspora. I'm working in my PhD project with a film corpus of 25 films from 1979 till today, which have been produced outside of Iran, and are dealing with the life of Iranians abroad. The filmmakers are Iranian themselves and treating autobiographical events in their films. The deterritorializing and re-deterritorializing journeys of the characters take a number of forms, and they cross many borders, not only physical and geographic, but also psychological, metaphorical, social, and cultural borders. The role of the border is very much curtailed by a migrant population whose essential element of identity is knowing how to first cross the border itself, pass through the border area, and then live outside it whilst avoiding expulsion. The key moments of border crossing in the films of the Iranian diaspora occur in certain empirical border places which act as portals to other places and times and are charged with intense emotions. Such portal places are, for instance, hotels and motels, which often serve only as transitional places of residence, where people anxiously await money, family members, visas, and tickets to their destination. This conveys to a microcosm, a community building in which the migrants engage in talks, games, drinking, making phone calls, writing and receiving letters, listening to the homeland's music, and watching television. The relationship to the homeland is still very strong as the phone calls, letters, and music show. They don't participate to the daily life outside of the hotel, so that it seems as if they were out of space and out of time because of their indefinitely situation. These are film stills from 4 different movies. You can see how similar these scenes are, all taking place into hotels. I will not have time to show you film scenes I have prepared, so I just go through the paper. In terms of movement, it is in a second time interesting to look at scenes taking place in vehicles such as airplanes, ships, buses, or cars. There is a dialectical relationship between the inside closed spaces of the vehicles and the outside open spaces of nature and nation. The next example I wanted to show you is from the film I Don't Hate Las Vegas Anymore from Kaveh Zahedi from 1994. Kaveh is doing a road trip with his father and half-brother from Los Angeles to Las Vegas in order to intensify their relationship. In this particular scene, Kaveh is sitting alone in the back of the car, talking about his feelings towards his Iranian roots. And the predominant feeling here is shame. He's saying that he's ashamed of his father and of his Iranianness. And the inside closed space reflects Kaveh's internal closed space. He is anxiously turning back to see if someone is coming. He chose this claustrophobic space to debate on his identity, which is, on the other hand, a space that moves. This may refer to the transitional aspect or even the changeability of his issues. Third, I want to examine portal places such as airports, seaports, and railway stations. The transitional moment is inherent to these places. The appearance of these places in the films is always bonded with an arrival in the West. The first example is from the film The Suitors from Bassem Ibrahimian from 1988. Mariam came with her husband to New York after he was accidentally murdered in a quarrel. She sees her chance for a new life, but her husband's friends are tracking her, which is why she sees only one way to escape the situation. At the end of the film, she puts herself into a suitcase, and the camera takes Mariam's perspective. We don't see anything and only hear her breathing. She puts herself into the nearest space one can imagine, which reflects the accumulation of all her feelings towards the film. The suitcase is something portable, and she carries away these feelings to fulfill her emancipation and abandon all restraint. The suitcase symbolizes movement and migration, but also anticipates arrival and settlement. The suitcase is a contradictory and multi-layered key symbol of exilic subjectivity. It contains souvenirs from the homeland, it connotes wanderlust, freedom, and a provisional life, and it symbolizes profound deprivation and diminution of one's possibilities in the world. Going out of the suitcase is the moment when finally Mariam attains in the West. The provisionality that the suitcase imposes, the improvisation it encourages, and the displacement it symbolizes may all become sources of new rootedness and identity. The last, I will not have time to the next scene is from the film Mariam from Ramin Seri from 2001. The narration is set in the time of the Iran hostage crisis and shows how it affects the life of Mariam, a teenage girl living in New Jersey. As additionally to the Iranian hostage crisis, Mariam's cousin Ali comes from Iran to study in the United States. Her world begins to stagger. In the scene where Mariam and her father pick up Ali at the airport, we come to know that Mariam speaks no Persian and is not familiar with Iranian habits. The combination of the three scales I mentioned before differ from one individual to another according to their position in the genealogy of generations. For instance, the first generation those who were born and have lived in the society of origin tend to privilege the local scale of the host country and the national scale of home country where they lived before their migration. The second generation takes into account more often the local and national scales of the host country where they were born and have lived in. At the very beginning of the film, Mariam says, "Yes, I was born in Iran, but we don't live there anymore. As far as I was concerned, Iran had nothing to do with me." This is changing towards the film. One last example is from the film For a Moment Freedom from Arash Tiriyahi from 2009, here present. It is a film about three groups of refugees all staying in Ankara at a hotel and waiting for asylum. One of the groups is consisted of Ali and Mertad with the children Azadeh and Arman, which is the true history of the director's siblings. They will undergo an odyssey before finally arriving in Vienna, where their parents await them impatiently. What is interesting in this scene is that two police officers are accompanying them through the path, and these extras aren't actors, but the real person, Azadeh, and the real person, Ali. They escort their doubles through the same path they went through 30 years ago. It is a doubling that opens up a new dimension. The airport doesn't remain a simple portal place between East and West, but becomes also a portal place between fiction and reality, past and present. The film embodies the constructiveness of identity by inscribing characters who are partial double split. In the early liminal phases of migration, the liminars are haunted by a profound dissonance between inside and outside. Their insides may feel ambivalent and unstable as they shift between multiple self-perceptions, identities, and cultures. The strategies of multiplication and doubling are put in the service of expressing exilic fragmentation and angst. The portal places have the function of what Arnold von Gernert called rite de passage. The examples of spaces and places, Michel Foucault would call them hétérotopie, and Marc Auger non-lieu, convey all to the passage from one status to another. Considering this, hybridity can be seen as the condition humana of migrants regarding identity, because when hybridity is conceived as a process rather than a description, it can embrace with the notion of migration, which is in itself a process. The diasporic film locates these processes into portal places. According to Homi Bhabha, the importance of hybridity, quote, "The importance of hybridity is not to be able to trace two original moments from which the third emerged. Rather, hybridity is the third space, which enables other positions to emerge," end quote. It is this betwixt and between that interests me in my work on the films of the Iranian diaspora, as they reflect in the most accurate way migration and diaspora in terms of transition and mobility. The globalization of capital and media also globalized the local, and the fragmentation of nation-states and the massive scattering of people transformed the meaning of the global. The films of the Iranian diaspora are interstitial because they are created astride and in the interstices of social formations and cinematic practices. Consequently, they are simultaneously local and global. Therefore, I have chosen the transitional and transnational places and spaces as privileged sites for examination of struggles over identity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alena. We move on the screen onto the stage. Next paper.